Hello, welcome back. Let me go to the Hicksian compensation test in this lecture. So, as we had already discussed, that in the Calderian case, you have a problem with the compensation, especially when the winners get compensated, and there is a possibility of moving from state A to B and a reversal of B to A in that sense. So, Hicks proposed a different potential compensation test for considering whether the move from 1 to 2 could be sanctioned or not. Now, under his understanding, the question in the Hicks test is where could the loser compensate the winner for foregoing the move and be no worse off than if the move took place. That is, using the Hicks test, if the answer is yes, the reallocation is not sanctioned, otherwise it is sanctioned in that sense. So let's look into the possibility of a Hicks test based on that same understanding. So let's look into the table for 1. Suppose at location 1 that 5 units of Y are transferred from B to the loser from a move to 2 to A in that context. So A's utility would be then go up to 100, the same as the allocation 2, while B's would go down to 75, higher than in the allocation 2. So the losers in a reallocation in that sense. Now, if that is the case, then there are so many other questions will come, and the Kaldor Hicks potential compensation test give different answers about the ranking of the two allocation under consideration. That this will not be the case for all reallocations that might be considered in that context. Let's look into the second possibility. So table 4.2 is an example where both tests give the same answer. For the Kaldor test, looking at the 2, that is, if you look into the table 2, the winner A could give the loser B 5 unit of X and still be better off than at 1, that is, utility is 150, while B would then be fully compensated for the loss involved in going from 1 to 2, that is, you have a utility which is 10 into 10, 10 times 10, which is equal to 100. On this test, 2 is superior to 1. For the Hicks test looks at 1, the most and the loser B could transfer to the winner A so as not to be worse off than in allocation 2. Now that is a 10 units of Y, but with 10 of X and 15 of Y, A would have a utility which is 150. So which is less than A's utility of at 2, which is 200. The loser could not compensate the winner. The loser could not compensate the winner for foregoing the move and be no worse off than if the move took place. So again, 2 is actually superior to 1. So in that sense, it is a bit complicated. From the above principle, we can see that when evaluating net benefit and the cost of a given action, the cost and benefit accruing to each individual should normally be added without without regard to the individuals to whom they accrue. This is actually one interesting criticism basically marked by Harbinger. And then it follows that if a project passes the compensation test, it is potentially Pareto improving that context. Therefore, you can basically go for it. And the second one is if the project is potentially Pareto improving, it should be adopted. So this is a kind of a proposition and then a conclusion which made by Harbinger based on this understandings. And this follows from the fact that every simple economic reform inflict a loss on some people. Yet when such reform have been carried through, compensation has not been given and economic progress has accumulated a role of victims sufficient to give all sound policy a bad name. This is very important. So the most important and a critical point which Kaldor was trying to advance in his particular proposition is the following. That is, if you want to basically improve the economic condition, or normally in the narrative, we can say that the growth of an economy. Now, if you aspire to have a growth in the economy, there should have a sort of a redistribution. Now, if the redistribution to the poorer or the people who are basically lost in the process of reallocation, then you must compensate. Otherwise, the point is actually makes the whole policy shift as a bad policy shift. And this is also true from the context of the real world. And from that point, let's move to the other issues. Like, suppose if we follow Hicks, that is a loser, basically a reallocation in a pure exchange private good economy need not be potentially Pareto improving, even if the sum of compensation variation over all individual is positive. So I basically don't understand and don't basically take part of what Hicks was trying to basically convince all of us. However, it doesn't mean that it is irrelevant in that context. That makes a sense. But the problem is that the Calderian proposition is more amenable as well as more what in a conceptual sense as well as in a real world policy making perspective is more appealing than what actually Hicks tried to point out. So Samuelson called this as money value or a rubber measuring rod in that sense. So considering an economy with one private good and n public good, each consumer has a utility of UIXY. Cost of private good vectors, which is normally y, is given by the function, which is cy. Some of the individual private consumption, normally we write it as cy, is a constant, and in public good economy, there is only one private good. Now you have a public good and in private good you have on the contrary, and this can be used as a measuring rod, avoiding index number problems, etc. So reasonable if policy change does not substantially affect the relative price of the private good, then you have actually the following proposition, or you call it as the inference. That is, the theorem follows as for a public good economy, a project passes the compensation test if and only if it is potentially Pareto improving. Then it looks like actually the following. So a potential Pareto improvement in a public good model is the following. Like, you look at the UP and UP dash. So in the UP you have the initial thing, and UP double dash you have a which is again has a possibility even in the after redistribution. So this is actually makes a kind of switching and reswitching issue. Normally in the sort of welfare perspective, like see, look at the curve, and the curve is basically crosses the previous possibilities, and still you say that this is better. And if it is a pure private good case of one good of what is actually Samuelson said, as in his paper, uh, this is not a problematic one. But in real world, you don't actually really talk about all that, and or even in theoretical sense, this is a too strict assumption for a commoner to understand. So, however, for economic students, this is not necessarily a too simplistic one. So a Satoshi style paradox remains as the following. That is, in the original sense, we said that there is a possibility of switching and a reswitching. That is, an ordering or an on allocations that respect the compensation principle will have still cycles. That is, even with a single public good. Now, even a single public good, we had already seen in the previous diagram. There is a possibility of uh, an issue. Now, if therefore, that is, if you have a UPY and a UPY dash, see, A is actually there in the very beginning, that where B was not good. At the same time, even if you have a reallocation when A is still not that good, if it is not actually B, any other point other than that crisscrossing point, then you say that that is actually the kind of thing. But we had already seen in the earlier Samuelson's kind, if you say that B follows in the same curve, then it has to follow certain principle that any other point is being rejected based on that. And if A has the same problem, then any other point is actually being rejected in the same sense. So if that is the case, then we have actually end up with a lot of paradoxical kind of possibilities. So this is what is normally called the Satoshki's paradox, and Kaldor Hicks Satoshky test therefore need to be approved. Sorry, need to be done and then get the efficiency angle approved. So for that, then let's go to the details of it. And for an unambiguous results from the potential compensation test, it is necessary to use both Kaldor and Hicks criteria. The Kaldor Hicks Satoshky test says that a reallocation is desirable if and only if, that is all what you call if the winner could compensate the loser and still be make better of A, and second when the loser could not compensate the winner for the reallocation not occurring and still be as well off as they would have been if it not did occur. So this is actually a kind of a double test in that sense. So it is not only the first test that is actually the Calderian test, that is winner could compensate the loser and still be better off, but it also has to basically follow the principle that the loser could not compensate the winners for the reallocation not occurring and still be as well off as they would have been if it did occur. So if that is the case, then you have a third Kaldor-Sitorsky test in that sense. In the example 4.2, the move from 1 to 2 passes the test. In the example 4.1, it doesn't in that sense. So the second one is a better one than the first in that sense. So, that is, but compensation may not produce fairness in that sense. For example, if you look into the third 4.3, that is you have attained for X and 5y for A, which gives 50 for the initial allocation and it's already given. But in the second allocation case, look at it. So that is X gives a 10 utility and Y gives 4 and a total of 40. That is 10 times 4. But for B, it is not like that, 15 times 16, which is 240. So now this is actually basically poses a kind of a problem which is called the fairness problem. That is, compensation test informs much of an application of welfare economics to environmental problem. The attraction of compensation test is that they do not require reference to social welfare function. However, while they do not require reference to social welfare function, it is not the case that they solve the problem that the use of social welfare function addresses. Rather, compensation test simply ignore the problem. So the final one is compensation test treat winners and losers equally. No account is taken for the fairness of the distribution of welfare or well-being in that sense. So that is what is actually we are going to talk about in this lecture. That is, if you look into the fairness aspect, then consider the example of table 4.3. That is what I actually in the end I said. Considering a move of 1 to 2, A is the loser and B is the winner. According to both 1 and 2, that is earlier we had placed for the pass Kaldor Hicks and Sitorsky's test. Uh, if you define it, notes that 2 is superior to 1 and such a reallocation passes Kaldor Hicks and Sitorsky test. But A is the poorer of the two and the reallocation in that sense. So in either, I mean, even if you do that, of course, there is a massive increase in the welfare, or sorry, massive increase in the efficiency of that kind, and you say that that is being approved. But what is actually happens in the real context is that there is a clear case of fairness violation in that sense. So this is what is actually the problem with the compensation of that kind, but doesn't mean that this is always the case. But anyway, we will be looking into that aspect in a detailed fashion later. So let's look into the compensation test and fairness aspect. So in the practical use of the compensation test, welfare or distributional issue are usually ignored, and the monetary measure of winners gains benefit and loser lose cost are usually given equal weight irrespective of the income and wealth level. This is a serious problem as well as a criticism against this particular approach, and in part this is because it is often difficult to identify winner and loser sufficiently close to be able to say what their alternative income and wealth levels are. But even in case where it is clear that say cost falls mainly on relatively poor benefit, mainly on the better off, economists are reluctant to apply welfare wage when applying the compensation test by comparing total gains and total losses. They simply report on whether or not this amount of gain exceeds that amount of loss in that sense. So, various justifications are offered for this practice. That is, in real world, how to overcome this. First, at the level of principle, that is, there is no generally agreed social welfare function for them to use, and it would be inappropriate for economists to themselves specify which social welfare function or the second one, as a practical matter, it aids clear thinking to separate matters of efficiency from matters of equity, with the question of a relative size of gains and loss being are treated as an inefficiency issue, while the question of their incidence across poor and rich is an equity issue. And normally, the equity issues are not being considered in that sense for the economic analysis of efficiency or efficiency analysis in that context. In this view, when considering some policy intended to affect reallocation, the job of the economic analysis is to ascertain whether the gains exceed the loss in that context. Very simplified way of looking at it. And if they do, the policy can be recommended on efficiency ground, and that's known. It is known that the beneficiaries could compensate the loser. It is a separate matter for government to decide whether compensation should actually occur and to arrange for it to occur if it is actually thought desirable. Now, this is actually inflicts a lot of ideas regarding the efficiency aspect or understanding the efficiency aspect vis-a-vis the fairness aspect, because the fairness aspect is not necessarily being considered at all in this context. So redistribution, who the same problem we can actually see with the Paretian case also. Who is actually having how much percentage is not the problem with the efficiency perspective. Whether the pie is being distributed, that's the only concern, and after all, for the economists in that sense. So that is whether I am holding 99% and the other person 1%, doesn't matter whether I am actually exhausted the pie with the same intensity. So my 1%, my 99% is equally weighted with the 1% of the other person. So this is actually the kind of efficiency which is talked in the Paretian sense, and the same logic being applied by the Kaldor Hicks case also by applying the potential Paretian notion to the efficiency understanding, or basically the social welfare economists always go in line with this kind of an argument. With that, let me conclude today's lecture, because otherwise it will be a lengthy one. So thank you for listening, and let us wind. Good night.